gentlemen. My name is David Callan. I'm a PhD student in the School of Middle East and North African Studies here at the University of Arizona, and a research associate with SISMEC, which is the Southwest Initiative for the Study of Middle East Conflicts. And on behalf of my colleagues at SISMEC, along with our partners from the National Security Law and Policy Society, Ellie Rushforth and Nikhil Damle, as well as the Federalist Society for Law and Public Policy Studies, I'd like to welcome you to today's panel entitled Drones, the Past, Present, and Future of America's New Way of War. Drones have been a mainstay of national security and foreign policy discussions for the better part of a decade. Though most closely linked with the Bush administration post 9/11, the sheer number of attacks under the Obama administration point to its affinity for their use. Essentially, drone warfare has become the key tool of the so-called war on terror, largely through the notion of targeted killing. The military uses drones in Afghanistan as it did in Iraq, and the CIA operates a covert, if well-known, drone program aimed at counterterrorism in Pakistan. The death of Osama bin Laden and the increased activity of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, mark a turning point in refocusing counter-terror activities away from the AFPAC theater to the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula and the Horn of Africa, namely Yemen and Somalia. While even prior to this shift, the legal and ethical ramifications of the new American way of war were coming under question, the killing of AQAP leader Anwar al-Awlaki, an American citizen, has brought the issue front and center. Many of you here are aware that on Monday, Attorney General Holder commented on the legality of these activities. But increasingly, drones are also being used in non-military, non-covert operations by the likes of Customs and Border Patrol, the Coast Guard, and various levels of domestic law enforcement, with many more applications on the horizon. So, what are the origins of drones and what variety of functions do they perform? In terms of the military and counterterrorism, can they be considered successful at face value, or are there more serious ramifications for their use abroad? From an American perspective, are targeted killings legal, especially when dealing with American citizens, and what are the ethical considerations? Finally, where do we go from here? What is the future of drone technology, and what are the broader implications of its use? It's these types of questions that our panel is going to explore with you this morning. So now I would like to introduce each of the presenters in the order in which they will be presenting. Our first speaker will be Colin Owens. Colin has served in both the U.S. Army and the U.S. Air Force Reserve. He is currently pursuing a dual master's degree in the School of Middle East and North African Studies and the School of Government and Public Policy. His research interests include counterterrorism, insurgency and counterinsurgency, and illicit transnational networks. Colin's presentation will outline the history of drones, their current use, and the potential blowback from these uses. Following Colin will be Alexis Henshaw. Alexis is a PhD candidate in political science, where her major is international relations with a minor in methods. She studies women's participation in rebel groups involved in intrastate conflict, as well as the impact of conflict on women and gender in politics. Recent presentations and papers include the use of rape as a weapon based on societal views of women and theories of women combatants. The title of Alexis's presentation is Gendering Drones, Desecuritization, Displacement, and Discourse. Our third speaker will be Professor John Radzan. Besides his work as a corporate lawyer and as a consultant, Professor Radzan served for over 8 years in the federal government. He is an expert on legal issues related to national security and is often quoted by the local and national media. His combination of law enforcement experience, intelligence community experience, and the Middle Eastern origins makes him unique within the legal academy. His presentation will address the constitutionality of targeted killings. And last, but certainly not least, is Dr. Layla Hudson. Dr. Hudson is Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies in the School of Middle Eastern and North African Studies, as well as the Director of SISMEC. Her research interests include Middle Eastern media, culture, and conflict dynamics. In addition to providing a critical analysis of the legality of targeted killing via drones, Dr. Hudson's presentation will look at what is on and just over the horizon in terms of drone technology. At the end of everyone's discussion, we will begin to open the floor for some questions. And also, if you would like to sign up for our email list, there is a pad over here to my right, the yellow pad, and also some brochures that can provide you some more information about what we do as a group. So without further ado, we'll turn it over to our first speaker, Colin Owens.
All right, so I'm going to be talking about drones, I'll go into basically what they are and how they're being used, and then we'll move into how they're being deployed, and then the blowback that are associated with drones. All right, so uses of drones. We start off with, I've listed here just some of the uses that David has touched on. So CBP is using this. Police departments want to use more drones, and they've been used to monitor wildfires. And future uses for these things include disaster relief, dangerous research in dangerous locations, so actually going into hurricanes and things like that, and also environmental monitoring. And of course the lethal uses, which will be what we focus on mainly here, mainly the military and the CIA. So the civilian development of drones mainly started with CBP, the first civilian police agency to actually own these things and use them. The Coast Guard is also using them along the border. And in addition, there's been this new act that was just signed this year, which opens the door to more civilian uses of drones for agriculture, for environmental monitoring, but also for police departments to own these things themselves. And so here are just some pictures of non-lethal drones, just to give you an idea. These things up the upper left are really small, less than 20 pounds. And the one that looks like a circle is actually owned by Dado County Police Department already. And then there are different versions of these things. So I just wanted to give you an idea of what they look like. Now, lethal drone development, this started, you can go back before Vietnam, but for the purposes of this talk, there's no point. And then actually in the Gulf War, you see drones being used, and these were procured from actually an Israeli developer. And these are non-lethal drones. In the most current conflict, or conflicts that we've seen, the U.S. has started developing their own drones. These are mainly the Predator and the Reaper, which are being used, or had been used in Bosnia, Serbia, and are currently being used in Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, Somalia, and etc. So now the control of these things is kind of interesting because both the military and the CIA use them. And both the military and the CIA use them in non-war zones, which sort of adds a complication to this. And drones have also completed fully autonomous flight. So without any human input, taking off, flying missions, and actually landing completely on their own. Now here are just some pictures of these things, the Predator, Reaper, and there's a helicopter version of this now, which is also made fully autonomous flight. And then the bottom right is the first example of this used during the first Gulf War. Now this is how these things actually work. So they're launched in location, and then control is taken over from someone in the US, and the information is relayed off a satellite. So this is the current model that we're working off of. This idea of fully autonomous flight sort of takes this up a notch in that the idea is that drones will actually be able to monitor other drones, so that drones will be flying and be able to target or identify things and have other drones actually engage those targets, which is scary from my opinion, or from my standpoint. The idea that drones can fly other drones or actually coordinate in between each other is nerve-wracking. Now, drone deployment. We see drones used in Iraq and Afghanistan, and these are generally, used in support of troop movement, whether it's replacing the jets that were traditionally used, or using drones for surveillance instead of helicopters. So this is basically just taking over the role of piloted aircraft. Now, the other type of deployment is in support of this counterterrorism mission that David brought up. And we have long established bases in Pakistan where most of these drone attacks have actually taken place. And there are new bases, Ethiopia, Seychelles, Djibouti, and the Arabian Peninsula. And this is really a re-emphasis after bin Laden was killed. And so this is just a comment from the Africa Command spokesman. And it's basically the idea is to create these overlapping circles of surveillance in the region where Al-Qaeda offshoots could emerge for years to come. And this next slide will actually be a picture of those overlapping circles of surveillance. And so this is only 3 of the actual bases that are plotted on this. There's an additional one somewhere in the Arabian Peninsula. The exact location has not been identified as far as I can tell. But you can see how the idea is to have enough drones in all over the Indian Ocean that can actually cover the region 24/7 nonstop. So we move on to this idea of strategy and the idea behind these drones, and it's all driven by this counterterrorism idea to kill or capture. And failing any sort of ability to capture, the idea is that these people should be killed, and drones are the easiest way to do this. And so this is largely driven the policy in Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia. There are two different strikes that have been identified. The signature strikes, which basically, flying around, if they see a group of people who have weapons and who could be militants, then they can strike that. And this has just recently changed, as far as I understand, that this type of use of the drone has been stopped. But the other type is still going on, and this is the personality strike, in which they are actually pinpointing specific people, or that's the idea. And so this is, different than what was done in Iraq and Afghanistan, this idea of counterinsurgency. And so this idea is to actually co-opt the opposition through political and economic policy. And I'm not advocating for any one point of this at all, just to highlight the differences in between these approaches. So this is a chart, who gets killed by drones. And the last year, 2011, was actually taken from the New America Foundation database, and that's why there's the asterisks. And so these aren't actually numbers that SysMech has collected. So, but the other years, we actually went through all the journal articles relating to these attacks and found these numbers. So you can see that the attacks have been increasing up until 2011, and you see a slight drop. But what's most telling is this total deaths has been going up. Obviously, the 2011 is not. But you can also see that what are considered high-value targets to total death ratio is going up quite steeply as well. And so this, there are people that would claim that these numbers are wrong. And there are definitely issues with sourcing this stuff. But other people have come out with these same type of numbers. So these aren't, completely fabricated numbers. And so then we'll move into this idea of blowback, which is basically just unintended consequences of policy that we pursue. Sort of the externality. And I'll talk about 5 specific types of blowback. So the first one is purposeful retaliation. And really, this comes, you can see this with the suicide bombing that happened in Khost in 2009. And throughout this year, earlier in this year, there had been this push to kill this guy, Baitullah Masood, who actually became one of the tribal leaders after Nek Mohammed was killed by a drone in 2004. And so this all sort of centered around this one person. And there is an event where one of his commanders was killed, and the idea was that the U.S. would kill this commander, and Baitullah Masood would go to this funeral, hopefully, and then the U.S. would just strike the funeral. And so in this incident, up to 65 people have been killed. So this is definitely this signature strike. And just basing this all on the notion that hopefully this guy would actually attend a funeral is absolutely ludicrous. So anyway, the suicide bombing that actually happened was perpetrated by a Jordanian who had been sent to infiltrate these networks. And he actually went to the base in Khost, which was targeting Baitullah Masood, who this informant had gotten very close to. So this is the idea of purposeful retaliation. Then we move on to the second type of blowback, and this is the accidental guerrilla. And this is termed by David Kilcullen. And this is the idea that people would not normally join the insurgency actually join simply because of the local conditions. And this is almost always a product of foreign intervention whether it's people or something flying over the skies 24 hours a day. So this is actually a quote from Beytullah Masood. Every drone strike brings me 3 to 4 new suicide bombers. So this is very telling, and I'm sure there are more quotes like this. And again, David Kilcullen, the one who coined accidental guerrilla. So drone strikes are deeply aggravating to the population. And I'm not going to read this because you can read it, but basically what it does is bring the population into close proximity with the insurgents and actually, coalesce with the insurgents, trying to reject that foreign person or body that is coming in, whether it is drones or humans. So, U.S. complications, this idea of strategic confusion. I mentioned earlier that counterinsurgency was really the policy that's been used in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so on the other side of the border, in Pakistan, we're pursuing a counterterrorism policy. And so this creates a new body of insurgents in Pakistan who can infiltrate into Pakistan and complicate the counterinsurgency practices there. At the same time, this can foster further anti-American sentiment in Pakistan and other regions that we're doing this. So the fourth and fifth are destabilization, and this is in the region that these are taking place, and also precarious alliances. So these partner governments have largely allowed the U.S. to do this with very little restraint, which creates tension in between society and the government. And with that, this creates tensions in between the U.S. and the places this is actually happening. In Yemen, the U.S. killed a mid-level government official by accident. And so this, obviously halts the drone program and draws everyone's attention to it. With Pakistan, you can see numerous instances, mainly the CIA contractor, I can't remember his name, that was arrested, that was targeting people in Pakistan. You see drone strikes stop completely for 3 weeks after that. So the idea of destabilization and precarious alliances. So unresolved issues with the program. And one of the issues is still covert, even though it's in the newspaper, virtually every day or at least every week. And so there's really no clear process for targeting and definition of high-value target. And I know these are, somewhat legal issues, but it seems almost like people sit in a room and decide who should be on this list, and then they just carry out. There's limited reporting, not only in the U.S., due to the covert nature of this program, but also in the locations, like Fatah or Yemen. Reporting just is not as strong as we would like it to be to get accurate information. Now, the idea of U.S. citizens being killed by drones is also a big issue. And the first U.S. citizen that died in a drone strike was actually in Yemen in 2002, with the first drone strike outside a war zone. He was not specifically targeted, which makes it slightly different than al-Awlaki in 2011, who was the target of a drone strike. And Eric Holder's quotes appear again. And so beyond what I've presented, sort of the strategic disadvantages highlighted here, there are many moral, ethical, and legal considerations to the use of drones. And so that's all I have, and I think that leads nicely into Alexia, sorry.
I'm going to be talking a little bit about gendered aspects of the use of armed drones in particular. First of all, I want to wish everybody a happy International Women's Day. So it's just fortuitous that this opportunity happens to fall on this day. But basically, I'm going to be making some connections here between the use of armed drones and also themes of my own work, including issues of human security and issues of gender security. To kind of define those terms briefly, human security basically involves thinking more broadly about security than we have in the past. It's the idea that security is not just defined as being the absence of war or traditional concerns about national defense, but it also requires a focus on sort of broader quality of life issues, right? Meeting basic needs, having access to food, having access to water, having access to basic health needs, just being and feeling secure in one's day-to-day life. And this also kind of connects to the idea of gender security, which is an emerging international norm. This is the idea of governments and actors involved with security taking into account the impact of war and conflict on women in particular. So this involves asking questions like, what is the unique experience that women have as combatants, as victims, as those living in conflict zones, as peacemakers and as policymakers? It involves asking how we can work at achieving security for women. This is a norm that's really been emerging in the international community. So certainly over the past couple of decades, we've seen things like UN Security Council resolutions 1325 and 1820, which deal specifically with women in conflict, inclusion of women in the peace process, and also dealing with sexual violence in conflict. We've also seen the norm emerging through indictments and trials for crimes like rape and human trafficking that particularly affect women. These are actions that have taken place in the International Criminal Tribunals for Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and also in the International Criminal Court, and also through the efforts of countries like the United States, which I'll come back to later in the presentation. These ideas of human security and gender security, they have a lot in common. There's a common focus on the idea of vulnerable populations. There is a shared focus on a broad definition of security, and there's also the recognition that conflict and violence occur outside of war zones and outside of this traditional idea of, declared interstate conflict. Why have these issues emerged and why have they become important at this point in time? Certainly since the end of the Cold War, we've seen changes in how wars and conflict are conducted. We see things like, for example, the proliferation of small arms, which has brought more conflict into urban areas. We see changes such as less tightly controlled rebel groups, more fighting occurring among insurgencies, ethnic warfare, which often leads to attacks on women in particular, being seen as bearers of religion and culture in various societies. And there's also, again, a relevance here to the use of these armed drones, which involves conflict occurring outside the traditional confines of war. So I want to talk about two specific elements that have a gendered impact in terms of the use of armed drones. I want to talk about desecuritization and also displacement. And I'll conclude with a few comments about how discourse against the use of armed drones is becoming gendered, in particular in Pakistan and Yemen. First of all, in terms of desecuritization, drones create a danger to civilians. We heard some of this in Colin's presentation. The problem is that we can't tell exactly what that danger is. So numbers on this are really dodgy. In a CIA report that was published in the New York Times in 2011, the CIA claimed that no civilians were killed in drone attacks in Pakistan in the period between May 2010 and August 2011. This report was contradicted by reports from the Brookings Institution, the Long War Journal, and various journalistic outlets that disputed that number. The British Bureau of Investigative Journalism conducted a report in which they stated that at least 467 civilians had been killed by drone attacks in Pakistan, and perhaps as many as 800. And this was based on interviews that they conducted on the ground, actually going into these areas and talking to people. They also estimated that 178 children had been killed in armed drone attacks. And the Bureau of Investigative Journalism also reports that there were instances of targeted attacks on mourners, which we've heard about, and also on rescuers offering assistance to victims, which presents a lot of dodgy ethical and legal issues. There's also the broader issue of desecuritization in terms of the creation of a constant climate of fear that these armed drones are operating. And also, as we've heard in this issue of blowback, there's the idea of creating consequences and impacts on the ground in response to these attacks. So there's the idea of polarization, possibly driving more people into rebel groups, creating civil unrest. In Pakistan and Yemen, we've seen the use of drones provoking protests with a particular anti-American bent to them. And there's also a concern that if these drone attacks create civil conflict, again involving those small arms, poorly controlled rebel groups, possibly divisions along tribal or political lines, again, this brings us back to these consequences of conflict in which women in particular may suffer. There's also the issue of displacement, and there's a literal and figurative issue to this. So in terms of, literal displacement, the number of displaced persons worldwide is up 65% since the end of the Cold War. Pakistan, where the U.S. has conducted many of these armed drone attacks, currently has the highest number of refugees of any country in the world. As of 2010, that number stood at 1.9 million. And according to the UN High Commission for Refugees, 29% of the global refugee population currently comes from Afghanistan. The UNHCR also estimates that about 50% of refugees are female, but about 47% of refugees are also under the age of 18, and 11% are under the age of 5. And what this means is that a lot of displaced persons, particularly those who may end up in refugee camps or under the care of NGOs or the international community, are either women or are those who are dependent upon women, i.e. children. And yet, at the same time, we have a situation where women who end up in displaced persons or refugee camps are particularly vulnerable to attacks. They're vulnerable to being targeted by human traffickers, sexual assault, kidnapping. These are all known issues by the international community. The UN has established action items surrounding this. But this, just kind of shows the dangers of literal displacement. There's also figurative displacement. So in traditional and tribal societies, particularly in these areas of Pakistan and Afghanistan, the rights and mobility of women in particular outside the home is very limited. And yet we have these drone attacks that cause significant property damage, cause damage and destruction to homes, change the structure of the family for those who are affected by them. And so the result is kind of a double displacement for women. So there may be a literal sense of displacement in terms of the loss of their home, but there's also a figurative displacement taking place in terms of the loss of family and identity. For women who are widowed or displaced as a result of these attacks, they are placed in an even more vulnerable position than they may have been before. So this idea of gendered security, to return to this concept, has been recognized by the U.S., right? We've seen the U.S. involved in sending female engagement teams into areas in Afghanistan and Iraq in particular to reach out and establish relationships with the female population. Also at the end of last year, the U.S. passed a new national action plan on women, peace, and security. And so at a time when we're creating these new policies and attempting to be more inclusive of gender and recognizing the gender impacts in conflict, why not consider the gender impact of this policy? And certainly there is a gender discourse emerging in countries where these drone attacks have taken place and where populations have been affected. There have been women-led protests in both Yemen and in Pakistan. In 2011, a woman-led all-women protest that took place protesting the use of drones in Waziristan. Women expressed concerns about radicalization of the society, concerns for law and order. There was also a particularly feminine discourse that was emerging surrounding that, right? So a lot of women expressing concerns about how families are being affected or concerns for their own family who live in these impacted regions. Female leaders came out and spoke about urging dialogue and cooperation rather than conflict. In Yemen as well, we've seen women of all ages participating in these protests against drone attacks. A 2011 protest following the death of a teenager as a result of a drone attack mobilized women and children. What was interesting in particular, if you view the photos or video of this protest, it's primarily women and children who are playing the role of mourners, carrying pictures of the dead teenager, again, sort of drawing on that maternal discourse. And there were also, again, we have calls for unity and justice in response to these attacks as well. So just to kind of summarize, in spite of the fact that we have these emerging norms on human security and gender discourse, the impact of drone attacks on these vulnerable populations in particular is not always fully considered and discussed. So risks like displacement and desecuritization should be considered, and we should also, in taking this into consideration, we should pursue a deeper understanding of how women are being affected, and particularly include them in discussions surrounding the use of this policy.
Thank you.